November 17th, 1942. Lae Airfield, New Guinea. The maintenance crew gathered around the twisted aluminum scattered across the coral runway had never seen wreckage quite like this. Flight Petty Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa crouched beside a section of the strange aircraft's boom, running his fingers along metal that remained eerily intact despite the violence that had brought it down. The twin-engine American fighter had fallen 2 days earlier during a furious engagement over Buna, its pilot killed when the distinctive fork-tailed silhouette plunged into the jungle canopy 3 miles from the Japanese-held airfield. What troubled Nishizawa was not the wreckage itself, but what it represented. He had shot down the Lightning in a close-quarters dogfight, exploiting the pilot's inexperience and the Zero's superior turning radius. A victory, certainly. His 11th confirmed kill. But as he examined the American machine's construction, sophisticated turbo-supercharger installation, and heavy armament clustered in the nose, a disquieting thought crystallized. This pilot had fought poorly, making fundamental errors that any experienced aviator would avoid. He had tried to turn with the Zero, rather than exploiting his aircraft's obvious advantages in speed and power. The American had fought on Japanese terms and died for it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But what happened when American pilots learned to fight on their own terms? What happened when they understood what this machine could actually do? The questions multiplied as Japanese intelligence officers photographed every component, measured every dimension, and catalogued every system they could identify from the scattered debris. The twin Allison engines, each fitted with turbo-superchargers that enabled performance at altitudes where the Zero struggled. The concentrated firepower of 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose for devastating accuracy. The robust construction that allowed sections of the airframe to survive impacts that would have disintegrated a Zero. The massive fuel capacity evident even in the wreckage suggested operational range far exceeding any Japanese fighter. Commander Masatake Okumiya, the senior intelligence officer assigned to analyze Allied aircraft capabilities in the Southwest Pacific, arrived at Lae 3 days after the Lightning's destruction. His report, classified and distributed only to senior staff officers, contained a single sentence that would prove prophetic. American pilots are learning quickly what their machines can do, and we have no answer when they exploit these capabilities properly. The psychological transformation had begun. That morning in November 1942, examining wreckage from an aircraft they had successfully destroyed, Japanese aviation officers confronted uncomfortable evidence that victory might not depend on pilot skill or warrior spirit, but on industrial capacity and technological advantages they could neither match nor counter. The fork-tailed devil, as some Japanese pilots had begun calling the strange American fighter, represented something more disturbing than just another enemy aircraft. It embodied a fundamental shift in the Pacific Air War's trajectory, a shift that Japanese commanders were only beginning to comprehend. What neither Nishizawa nor Okumiya yet understood was that this particular Lightning represented the opening chapter of a story that would unfold with relentless logic over the following 32 months. The Americans were deploying an aircraft specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in Japanese doctrine, training, and equipment. More critically, they were producing this aircraft in quantities that Japanese industry could never hope to match. Flown by pilots trained to standards Japanese fuel shortages would soon make impossible to maintain. The war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The Zero's reign as the dominant fighter in the theater was ending, though many Japanese pilots refused to accept this reality. The Lightning, along with other advanced American fighters that would follow, was systematically dismantling the tactical and psychological advantages that had carried Imperial Japanese forces to stunning victories in 1941 and early 1942. But understanding this reality and adapting to it would prove to be two entirely different challenges. The foundation of Japanese confidence rested on achievements that seemed unassailable in late 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had established air superiority across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asian theater through a combination of extraordinary range, exceptional maneuverability, and adequate firepower. Its combat debut over China in 1940 had produced lopsided victories that established its reputation. The opening strikes of the Pacific War in December 1941 had showcased the Zero's capabilities to devastating effect. Japanese pilots had destroyed Allied air forces across a vast geographic expanse in just 6 months of operations. The Philippines fell, then the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. American, British, Dutch, and Australian pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes, Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks, and even modern aircraft, like the Curtiss P-40E Warhawk, had proven unable to effectively counter the Zero when flown by experienced Japanese naval aviators and army pilots. The mathematics seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. Zero pilots routinely achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better against Allied opposition. This dominance created a psychological framework that influenced every aspect of Japanese tactical thinking. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit of the enemy, exploiting the Zero's turning ability to force close-range dogfights where superior maneuverability decided outcomes. Pilots trained extensively in aerobatic maneuvers and gun marksmanship, preparing to defeat opponents through skill in traditional fighter combat. The approach had worked brilliantly against Allied aircraft and pilots encountered through mid-1942. But this tactical framework contained fatal assumptions. Japanese commanders assumed the war would be decided by fighter versus fighter combat, emphasizing maneuverability and pilot skill. They assumed Allied aircraft would continue attempting to dogfight with Zeros, allowing Japanese pilots to exploit their training and their aircraft's strengths. They assumed industrial production would remain secondary to tactical excellence. Most critically, they assumed American pilots would continue making the mistakes that had led to such favorable kill ratios in the war's opening months. The Zero's design philosophy reflected these assumptions. Engineer Jiro Horikoshi had created an aircraft optimized for range and maneuverability by ruthlessly eliminating weight. No armor protected the pilot. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capability. Structure was minimized to the absolute limits of safety. The result was a fighter that could outmaneuver anything it faced and operate at ranges that stunned Allied intelligence, but one that caught fire easily when hit and offered its pilot no protection against enemy fire. This represented a conscious design trade-off, not an engineering failure. Japanese planners believed that superior pilot skill would prevent the enemy from hitting their fighters, making defensive measures unnecessary weight. The approach proved devastatingly effective when Japanese pilots encountered poorly trained Allied pilots flying inferior aircraft. But it created vulnerabilities that American designers had specifically targeted when developing the next generation of fighters. The Lockheed P-38. Lightning embodied a fundamentally different design philosophy. Lockheed engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson and his team had created an aircraft around a specification that emphasized speed, altitude performance, range, and firepower rather than turning ability. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy that allowed pilots to return home on one engine. The turbo-supercharged Allison engines delivered full power at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where Zero performance degraded significantly. The concentrated nose armament allowed accurate fire from distances beyond effective range of the Zero's wing-mounted guns. Most critically, the Lightning possessed speed and climb performance that gave its pilots complete control over engagement terms. A properly flown P-38 could choose when to attack and when to disengage. It could dive on enemy formations from altitude, fire devastating bursts from its concentrated guns, then climb away faster than pursuing Zeros could follow. This boom and zoom tactical approach, as American pilots called it, completely negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage by avoiding the turning combat where that advantage mattered. When American pilots attempted to dogfight with Zeros in late 1942, Japanese pilots achieved victories and concluded the Lightning was simply another target. But American tactical doctrine was evolving rapidly, driven by combat experience, intelligence assessments, and systematic analysis of engagement outcomes. Fighter groups were receiving explicit instructions to avoid turning combat with Japanese fighters, to maintain speed and altitude advantage, to attack from superior positions, and disengage before the enemy could respond effectively. This tactical evolution transformed the Lightning from a potentially vulnerable target into a deadly threat that Japanese pilots could neither catch nor escape. The psychological impact of this transformation would prove as significant as its tactical consequences. Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced and successful fighter pilots, encountered the Lightning's evolved capabilities over the Solomon Islands in early 1943. His account, documented in post-war interviews and memoirs, provides insight into how Japanese pilots perceived the changing tactical situation. Sakai had achieved his first victories flying the A-5M in China, transitioned to the Zero for the opening campaigns of the Pacific War, and accumulated victories against American, British, and Australian aircraft. His experience and skill were unquestionable. His initial encounters with P-38s had confirmed Japanese assumptions about American tactical incompetence. The strange twin-boomed fighters had attempted to dogfight with Zeros, allowing Sakai and his fellow pilots to shoot down several of them. The Americans seemed unfamiliar with their aircraft's capabilities, fighting in ways that negated their speed and altitude advantages. Japanese pilots delighted in these early victories, viewing the Lightning as another example of American industrial capability, producing sophisticated machines that poorly trained pilots could not utilize effectively. But by March 1943, Sakai noted a disturbing change. American pilots no longer accepted dogfight challenges. They patrolled at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the Zero struggled. When they attacked, they dove at tremendous speed, fired brief but accurate bursts, then climbed away before defensive maneuvers could be executed. Zeros attempting to pursue found themselves falling behind, unable to match the Lightning's climb rate and speed. Zeros that tried to escape by diving discovered the American fighters could dive faster, staying in firing position until the Zero pilot pulled out or died. The tactical situation had reversed completely. Sakai described the frustration of watching American fighters patrol overhead, knowing any attempt to climb to their altitude would leave his formation vulnerable during the laborious ascent. He detailed the helplessness of being unable to prevent American fighters from attacking at times and positions of their choosing. Most damaging to Japanese morale, he acknowledged that the Lightning pilot could decide whether combat occurred at all. If the situation favored the Americans, they attacked. If circumstances seemed unfavorable, they simply flew away, and no Zero could catch them. The P-38 would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could fly, Sakai later wrote. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The Lightning was in a most enviable position. He could choose to fight when and where he desired, and on his own terms. Under such conditions, the Lightning became one of the most deadly of all enemy planes. This represented a fundamental shift in the psychological dynamic of aerial combat. Japanese pilots had entered the war confident that superior skill and aggressive tactics would overcome any opposition. Now they faced opponents who refused to fight on terms that favored Japanese strengths. American pilots exploited their aircraft's advantages with systematic discipline that frustrated every Japanese tactical response. The warrior spirit and exceptional training that had carried Japanese pilots to victory after victory suddenly seemed irrelevant against enemies who fought from positions of overwhelming material advantage. The mathematical reality supporting this psychological shift was even more troubling. Lockheed's Burbank factory was producing P-38 Lightnings at rates exceeding 400 aircraft monthly by mid-1943. Production would accelerate further as manufacturing techniques improved and additional facilities came online. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38 fighters would be built, representing just one of several advanced American fighter types produced in vast quantities. Japanese aircraft production could not match these numbers. Nakajima and Mitsubishi factories produced approximately 500 Zero fighters monthly at peak output, but this represented total production of Japan's most important naval fighter, not just one type among several. Moreover, Japanese production faced increasing challenges from raw material shortages, Allied bombing, and dispersal of manufacturing to avoid concentrated attacks. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were conscripted and replaced by less skilled laborers. The industrial mathematics were becoming inescapable. America could afford to lose fighters at equal rates and still achieve air superiority through sheer numerical advantage. But the numerical disparity represented only part of the problem. American pilot training programs were producing aviators with 200 to 400 hours of flight time, including extensive instrument training and advanced tactical instruction. Japanese training, constrained by fuel shortages and loss of experienced instructors, was being compressed to minimum viable standards. New pilots arrived at operational units with barely 100 hours total flight time, minimal formation training, and almost no instrument capability. These inadequately trained pilots faced experienced American aviators flying objectively superior aircraft, a combination that produced predictable results. The Lightning's concentrated armament proved particularly devastating against lightly constructed Japanese aircraft. The 4 50-caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon mounted in the nose converged on a single point, allowing skilled pilots to destroy enemy aircraft with brief, accurate bursts. Japanese fighters typically mounted 2 or 3 machine guns in the fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, plus additional guns mounted in the wings. This dispersed firepower pattern required longer firing passes and more ammunition expenditure to achieve kills. More critically, wing-mounted guns created convergence challenges. They were harmonized to converge at specific ranges, typically 200 to 300 meters. At closer or longer ranges, the bullets' trajectories diverged, reducing hit probability. The Lightning's nose mounting eliminated this problem entirely. Whether firing at 100 meters or 400 meters, all rounds from all guns traveled along nearly parallel paths, creating a devastating stream of projectiles that remained concentrated across a wide range of combat distances. American pilots exploited this advantage ruthlessly. They learned to open fire at ranges where Japanese fighters could barely return effective fire, pouring concentrated streams of 50-caliber and 20mm rounds into targets that caught fire easily and offered no protection to their pilots. Zero pilots who survived Lightning attacks often reported seeing tracers converging from impossible distances, followed immediately by impacts that set fuel tanks ablaze or severed critical control cables. The psychological impact of facing such accurate long-range fire eroded Japanese pilot confidence, even among the most experienced aviators. The Lightning's twin-engine configuration provided another critical advantage that Japanese pilots came to fear. Single-engine fighters like the Zero became helpless when their engines suffered battle damage. A holed cylinder, severed fuel line, or damaged cooling system transformed the aircraft into a gliding coffin, forcing the pilot to ditch at sea or crash land if over enemy territory. The Lightning could sustain damage that would destroy a single-engine fighter and continue flying on its remaining engine, allowing the pilot to return to base for repairs and fly again the next day. This capability frustrated Japanese pilots who watched their carefully aimed bursts damage Lightning engines, only to see the American fighter limp away to fight another day. The robust construction that protected Lightning pilots and airframes stood in stark contrast to the Zero's fragility. Japanese pilots increasingly understood they faced opponents protected by armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and redundant systems, while they flew aircraft that offered no protection beyond their own skill at avoiding hits. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The range disparity proved equally demoralizing. Zero fighters could operate at distances that had shocked Allied planners in 1941, with combat radius exceeding 700 miles under optimal conditions. This capability had enabled the devastating attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, allowing carrier-based fighters to provide escort at ranges thought impossible by Western intelligence. Japanese pilots took pride in their aircraft's endurance, viewing it as confirmation of superior design and operational planning. But the Lightning's range dwarfed even the Zero's impressive endurance. With external drop tanks, P-38 fighters routinely flew missions exceeding 900 miles, fought for 15 minutes, and returned to base with fuel reserves. The mission that intercepted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto on April 18, 1943, demonstrated this capability with devastating effect. 16 P-38 fighters flew over 400 miles from Guadalcanal to Bougainville at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection, climbed to intercept altitude, engaged the Japanese formation, and returned to base. One aircraft ran so low on fuel it diverted to the Russell Islands, but the mission profile would have been completely impossible for any other Allied fighter in service at that date. The Yamamoto interception represented more than a tactical success. It demonstrated that American fighters could reach any location within the Japanese defensive perimeter, fight effectively, and return home. No Japanese base, no transport flight, no combat air patrol was safe from lightning attacks. The psychological security that had come from operating beyond Allied fighter range evaporated. Japanese pilots understood that American fighters could appear anywhere, anytime, and there was nothing Japanese forces could do to prevent these incursions. Commander Okumiya's intelligence assessments became increasingly somber through 1943 as the pattern of lightning operations clarified. His reports documented the growing capability of American pilots, the increasing numbers of P-38 fighters appearing in combat, and the systematic nature of American tactical evolution. But more significantly, his analysis revealed the fundamental problem facing Japanese forces. Even perfect Japanese tactics could not overcome the Lightning's performance advantages. Even the most skilled Japanese pilots could not force combat on a Lightning pilot who chose to disengage. This represented a psychological inflection point for Japanese aviation. The warrior ethos that emphasized spirit and aggression as decisive factors suddenly seemed inadequate against enemies who fought with systematic calculation, exploiting material advantages rather than seeking traditional combat. Japanese tactical doctrine, built around concepts of decisive engagement and aggressive pursuit, offered no effective response to American boom and zoom attacks. Modifications to Zero fighters and deployment of improved aircraft types would help, but the fundamental imbalance in aircraft performance and industrial capacity could not be overcome through tactical innovation alone. Japanese maintenance personnel examining Lightning wreckage provided technical intelligence that confirmed the worst assessments. The turbo-supercharger installations were sophisticated engineering achievements far beyond Japanese manufacturing capabilities. The Allison engines demonstrated advanced metallurgy and precision manufacturing that Japanese factories could not replicate with available materials and machine tools. The electrical systems, instruments, and radio equipment all reflected industrial sophistication that Japan lacked. One captured P-38 component particularly troubled Japanese engineers. A small data plate riveted to the airframe listed the aircraft's serial number, 42-67762, and manufacturing date. The plate indicated this particular Lightning was one of hundreds built that month. Japanese engineers calculated production rates from serial numbers observed on multiple captured aircraft and wreckage. Their conclusion was devastating. Lockheed was producing more Lightning fighters monthly than Japan produced of all fighter types combined. This industrial reality influenced every subsequent Japanese tactical and strategic decision. Commanders understood that trading fighters at equal rates meant Japan would lose. Even achieving kill ratios of 2-to-1 favoring Japan would result in defeat as American production overwhelmed diminishing Japanese numbers. Only by achieving consistently lopsided victories could Japan maintain viable fighter strength. But American fighters like the Lightning were making such victories impossible to sustain. The impact on Japanese pilot morale became increasingly evident through 1943 and into 1944. Combat reports began reflecting fatalism absent in earlier accounts. Pilots who had entered the war confident of victory now wrote of hoping to survive another mission, to see home again, to die taking at least one American with them. The aggressive pursuit of glory that had characterized Japanese fighter operations gave way to grim determination to fulfill duty despite worsening odds. Veteran pilots who understood the situation tried to prepare new arrivals for the reality they would face. But the compressed training pipeline produced pilots with inadequate preparation for the combat environment awaiting them. Inexperienced pilots arrived at forward bases, flew several missions, and died without ever developing the skills necessary for survival. The veteran pilots who might have mentored them were themselves being killed at unsustainable rates. The entire Japanese fighter force was hemorrhaging experience and expertise that could not be replaced. The Lightning's success in the Pacific theater produced statistical evidence of this decline. American P-38 pilots achieved over 1,800 confirmed victories against Japanese aircraft between 1942 and 1945. The aircraft accounted for more Japanese kills than any other American fighter type. Over 100 P-38 pilots became aces by destroying 5 or more Japanese aircraft. The two highest-scoring American fighter pilots of the war, Major Richard Bong with 40 victories and Major Thomas Maguire with 38 victories, both flew Lightnings exclusively in the Southwest Pacific. These numbers reflected not only the Lightning's capabilities, but also the systematic degradation of Japanese fighter effectiveness. Bong and Maguire achieved their victories against increasingly inexperienced Japanese pilots flying aircraft that were progressively outclassed by American fighter development. Both Americans survived scores of combats through a combination of exceptional skill, superior aircraft performance, and tactical discipline that emphasized survival rather than glory. Both understood they were more valuable alive than dead, more effective over time than in any single engagement. This represented a fundamental difference in American and Japanese approaches to fighter operations. American doctrine emphasized preservation of experienced pilots, rotating them to training roles after completing combat tours to pass expertise to new arrivals. Japanese doctrine kept pilots in combat until they died or were too severely wounded to fly. American pilot experience accumulated in the training pipeline, creating a system that produced progressively better trained aviators. Japanese pilot experience died in burning aircraft over the Pacific, lost forever to the service that desperately needed it. By mid-1944, the Lightning's impact extended beyond direct combat effectiveness. American fighters were achieving air superiority across the Pacific, enabling bombing operations, supporting amphibious invasions, and interdicting Japanese supply lines. The bomber escort mission that had driven the Lightning's original design specification was proving devastatingly successful. American heavy bombers could strike targets across the Pacific with fighter escort throughout entire missions, rendering Japanese air defenses increasingly ineffective. Japanese attempts to develop counter-tactics achieved limited success. Some units experimented with head-on attacks, approaching Lightning formations from directly ahead to minimize exposure to the American fighters' superior speed and diving ability. This tactic occasionally produced victories, but exposed Japanese fighters to the Lightning's concentrated nose armament during the most vulnerable phase of the attack. Other units tried standing combat air patrols at maximum altitude, attempting to force American fighters to climb to them rather than allowing the Americans to attack from above. But the Lightning's superior high-altitude performance meant Japanese fighters arrived at high altitude already strained by the climb, while American fighters cruised comfortably at those heights with full combat capability. The deployment of improved Japanese fighters like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony and later the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank represented attempts to match American fighter performance through better aircraft design. Both types offered significant improvements over the Zero in speed, dive performance, and structural strength, but both arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to affect strategic outcomes. Moreover, both suffered from the same systemic problems affecting all Japanese aircraft production by late war. Quality control deteriorated. Materials shortages forced design compromises. Pilot training remained inadequate, and fuel scarcity limited operational training and combat sorties. The Ki-84 Frank, potentially competitive with American fighters when properly built and flown by experienced pilots, suffered from unreliable engines, landing gear that frequently collapsed on landing, and manufacturing quality so inconsistent that combat units had to cannibalize multiple aircraft to create single flyable examples. American intelligence officers testing captured Ki-84 fighters after the war found that when provided with high-octane fuel and proper maintenance, the aircraft performed impressively. But Japanese forces in combat rarely had access to quality fuel or spare parts, and the Ki-84's high-maintenance engine suffered catastrophically under field conditions. The systematic Allied advance across the Pacific destroyed Japanese ability to maintain effective fighter operations. Forward air bases that had supported aggressive Japanese operations in 1942 and early 1943 fell to American amphibious assaults, forcing Japanese fighters to operate from progressively more distant bases with longer supply lines. American submarines interdicted Japanese shipping with devastating effectiveness, sinking tankers carrying aviation fuel and transports carrying spare parts and ammunition. Strategic bombing destroyed Japanese production facilities, dispersing manufacturing to smaller sites that produced aircraft of declining quality. By early 1945, Japanese fighter units faced fuel shortages so severe that training flights were curtailed entirely. New pilots arrived at operational units having never flown the aircraft type they would take into combat. Formation training was impossible. Instrument training was non-existent. These pilots faced the final generation of American fighters, aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and the Vought F-4U Corsair that were even more capable than the Lightning, flown by experienced American pilots who had survived extensive combat and trained in comprehensive programs emphasizing survival and tactical discipline. The mathematical inevitability of Japanese defeat was evident to any commander who studied the statistics objectively, but the warrior ethos that pervaded Japanese military culture made acknowledging this reality nearly impossible. Pilots continued fighting despite hopeless odds, because duty demanded it, because surrender was unthinkable, because the alternative to fighting was accepting defeat. The fatalism that characterized late-war Japanese operations reflected recognition that victory was impossible, but that duty required continued resistance regardless of outcome. The Lightning's role in this deterioration was both direct and symbolic. Directly, the aircraft destroyed hundreds of Japanese fighters, killed or wounded thousands of pilots, and enabled American bomber operations that devastated Japanese logistics and production. Symbolically, the Lightning represented the industrial and technological advantage that made Japanese defeat inevitable. The fork-tailed devil that Japanese pilots cursed was not just an aircraft but an embodiment of American capacity to design, produce, and deploy advanced weapons in quantities Japan could never match. The examination of Lightning wreckage that had begun in November 1942 continued throughout the war, as more American aircraft were shot down or crashed in territory held by Japanese forces. Each examination confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. American engineering was sophisticated, American manufacturing quality was high, American industrial capacity was overwhelming. Japanese engineers and intelligence officers documented these findings in reports that circulated through command structures, providing objective evidence of the material imbalance. But documentation alone could not bridge the capability gap. Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure to replicate American production rates. The nation's limited access to strategic resources like aluminum, petroleum, and high-grade steel constrained both the quantity and quality of aircraft production. The dispersal of manufacturing to avoid bombing further degraded production efficiency. Most critically, the systematic destruction of experienced pilots created a deficit that no amount of industrial effort could overcome. Aircraft could be built in months, but pilots required years to develop combat effectiveness, and Japan no longer had years available. The P-38 Lightning forced Japanese aviation to confront these realities earlier and more completely than any other American weapon system. Its combination of performance, firepower, range, and ruggedness created a fighter that Japanese pilots could neither defeat consistently nor escape reliably. Its production in vast quantities demonstrated industrial capacity that Japan could not match. Its systematic deployment in coordination with other American forces showcased operational sophistication that overwhelmed Japanese tactical responses. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, reflecting on his experiences after the war, acknowledged that the Lightning and other advanced American fighters had destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. This was not admission of cowardice or failure of spirit. It was recognition that morale alone could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in aircraft performance, pilot training, and industrial support. Japanese pilots continued fighting with courage that American opponents acknowledged and respected. But courage could not make a Zero faster than a Lightning. Spirit could not give a Zero the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Warrior ethos could not manufacture the aluminum and aviation fuel necessary to maintain operational capability. The final accounting of the Lightning's impact extended beyond tactical victories or strategic effects. The aircraft represented a turning point in Japanese understanding of the Pacific War's trajectory. In November 1942, examining wreckage at Lae, Japanese officers began comprehending that pilot skill and warrior spirit would not be sufficient to achieve victory. By April 1943, when Lightnings intercepted and killed Admiral Yamamoto, Japanese commanders understood that no location was safe from American attack. By late 1943, statistical analysis made clear that Japanese fighter forces were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The psychological transformation this understanding created influenced every subsequent Japanese decision. The desperate measures of 1944 and 1945, including kamikaze operations and suicidal defensive stands, reflected recognition that conventional operations could no longer achieve acceptable outcomes. If well-trained pilots in competitive aircraft could not defeat American forces, then perhaps sacrificing pilots and aircraft in suicide attacks might achieve through desperation what skill could not accomplish through conventional combat. The fork-tailed devil that had crashed near Lae in November 1942 represented the first chapter of this story, but Japanese officers examining that wreckage had already understood its implications. The Lightning was not just another fighter. It was evidence of American capability to design and produce weapons specifically optimized to defeat Japanese aircraft and tactics. More such weapons would follow. Japanese forces would face progressively more capable American fighters, bombers, and support systems, while Japanese capability deteriorated under the pressure of attrition, resource constraints, and industrial inadequacy. The examination in that coral runway at Lae had been an autopsy of Japanese air superiority, though few recognized it at the time. The Lightning's twisted metal components told a story about industrial sophistication, engineering capability, and operational philosophy that contradicted everything Japanese doctrine assumed about the nature of air combat. Fighting spirit mattered, but it mattered less than turbocharged engines that delivered full power at 25,000 feet. Aggressive tactics mattered, but they mattered less than speed that allowed choosing engagement terms. Pilot skill mattered, but it mattered less than concentrated firepower that destroyed targets before they could respond effectively. The recognition of these truths created the psychological crisis that would define Japanese aviation for the remainder of the war. Pilots who had dominated Pacific skies in 1941 and early 1942 found themselves outmatched by enemies who fought with systematic discipline rather than warrior passion. Commanders who had planned operations assuming Japanese tactical superiority faced an enemy with overwhelming material advantages. Engineers who examined American aircraft confronted evidence of industrial and technological capabilities that Japan could not replicate within any relevant time frame. By war's end, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings had been produced, flying over 130,000 missions across every theater of operation. In the Pacific, the aircraft achieved its greatest success, destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter while maintaining combat availability that enabled continuous operations. The Lightning never achieved the legendary status of the Mustang or the widespread recognition of the Thunderbolt, but it accomplished what military aviation ultimately required. It defeated the enemy's air forces, enabled friendly operations, and returned its pilots home to fight another day. The fork-tailed devil had destroyed more than Japanese aircraft. It had destroyed the assumptions, the confidence, and the morale that had carried Japanese aviation to its early victories. That psychological defeat, more than any tactical outcome or strategic effect, defined the Lightning's true impact on the Pacific War. Japanese pilots who flew against the Lightning understood, often fatally, that the war had entered a phase where material advantage trumped warrior spirit, where industrial capacity determined outcomes more surely than individual courage. and where the mathematics of attrition made Japanese defeat inevitable, regardless of how valiantly its pilots fought. The examination that had begun at Lae in November 1942 continued until war's end, each piece of wreckage confirming what Japanese commanders increasingly understood but could never publicly acknowledge. They were fighting an enemy they could not defeat with available resources, tactics, or spirit. The lightning represented that reality in aluminum and alloy steel, in turbocharged engines and concentrated guns, in the simple fact that when Japanese pilots encountered American fighters flown properly, they died at rates that made victory impossible. That was the lesson written in the twisted metal scattered across Pacific Islands, in the combat reports filed by surviving pilots, in the intelligence assessments documenting American capabilities. It was a lesson that could be learned but not overcome, understood but not countered, acknowledged but not accepted without admitting defeat. And so Japanese pilots continued flying, continued fighting, continued dying in aircraft that could not match their opponent's performance, sustained by duty and honor even as they recognized the mathematical certainty of defeat. The fork-tailed devil had taught them that lesson well. They had understood, and they had no answer. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.